Sofia stared at her reflection in the mirror in her small room, lit only by a dim bulb. The blue dress she'd chosen seemed perfect, but her eyes kept returning to her feet. Her shoes, old and worn, betrayed her humble condition. The soles were already peeling at the toes, and a small brown stain remained, even after countless scrubbings. Still, she forced a smile, trying to believe no one would notice. The clock on the wall read 7:55 p.m. The minute hand seemed to mock her, ticking away too. Quickly, Sofia smoothed her hair, tucked a strand behind her ear, and took a deep breath. It was her first date in months, and she didn't want to be late. She grabbed her simple purse, took another deep breath, and whispered to herself, "Today will be different." But deep down, an insecurity throbbed like a drum. Outside, the street was silent except for the distant sound of a dog barking. Sofia walked with firm steps, but each click of her worn heels against the asphalt echoed like a reminder of her fragility. She tried to keep her head held high, wondering how she would be received. A chill in her stomach accompanied her every step, a mixture of anxiety and hope. As he walked, memories of his mother came to mind. She remembered the times she'd say, "A pair of shoes can change the way the world sees you." Those words now sounded like an omen. Sofia wished she could afford new ones, but her salary as a maid barely covered the household bills. So he made do with what he had, wearing courage along with the dress. As she approached the restaurant, Sofia felt a tightness in her chest. The place had bright windows, tables set with flowers, and people laughing in groups. The contrast between the surroundings and her worn shoes became even more stark. She hesitated in the doorway, looking down for a moment. But then she looked up, reminding herself that she deserved to be there as much as anyone else. Inside, the smell of fresh food mingled with the soft sound of violins playing in the background. Waiters hurried between the tables, balancing silver trays. Sofia took a deep breath and looked for him, the young man who had invited her. When she saw him waving from a table near the window, a sweet relief washed over her. For a moment she forgot about her shoes. She walked to the table, trying to keep her steps discreet, each movement calculated so no one would notice the state of her feet. She sat down across from him, who was already watching her with a curious smile. "You look beautiful," he said, but her eyes quickly dropped to the floor, staring where she feared most. Sofia noticed, but chose to ignore it, forcing another smile. The boy ordered wine, and while they waited, Sofia tried to loosen up. She talked about her work, the books she liked, the little things that made her happy. He listened, but always with a distracted air, as if he were measuring every detail of her. Sofia's heart beat fast, torn between hope and fear. Every giggle he gave seemed to carry a shadow of judgment. Suddenly, as she straightened her dress, her feet became visible under the table. He lowered his eyes and chuckled softly. "Those shoes, have you thought about changing?" he asked sarcastically, unconcerned if anyone had heard. Sofia's face flushed and she tried to change the subject, but noticed a couple at the next table looking at her and giggling. The air grew heavy, and the sound of the violin, once delicate, now seemed to mock. Sofia felt small, exposed, as if she were naked before everyone. He gripped the edge of the table tightly, his eyes watering. It was only the beginning of the night, but it already felt like the end of a dream. The young man leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, as if examining an object in a display case. His smile wasn't one of tenderness, but of superiority, as if he'd made a bold choice in inviting Sofia. She, on the other hand, searched for a spark of charm in every gesture, a sign that the evening could be special. Her heart beat fast, trying to hide the insecurity the shoes aroused. The table was decorated with a lit candle that danced with the air currents, casting golden reflections on her face. Sofia seemed to glow in the firelight, but for him, it was just another opportunity to show his control. He ordered the most expensive dish on the menu without consulting her, while she politely chose something simple. The contrast between them was already becoming apparent. As they talked, he made a point of showing off his small achievements. A new car, his recent job at a well-known company, trips he didn't particularly enjoy but which made for great photos. Sofia listened attentively, smiling slightly, even when the stories didn't interest her. She tried to convince herself that this was just his way of showing off, perhaps a hint of disguised nervousness. But with each word, the gulf between them widened. She spoke of simple dreams, like studying at night or renovating their small kitchen. He, in response, laughed disdainfully, as if it were childish naivete. The sparkle in Sofia's eyes gradually dimmed, while the candle flame seemed to burn ever dimmer, reflecting the heavy atmosphere. The waiter brought the wine, pouring the ruby liquid into glasses. Sofia took hers carefully, trying to imitate the elegant posture of the other women around her. But he raised his own glass exaggeratedly, drawing attention from the neighboring tables, as if he were the star of the evening. Sofia, shy, toasted with a discreet smile, but her mind was already beginning to drift into sad thoughts. In a moment of silence, she tried to strike up a conversation about music. She asked him what his favorite band was, hoping to find some common ground. He laughed, shaking his head. "You probably wouldn't even know them." The sentence fell on her like a stone, cold and hard. Still, Sofia maintained her composure, biting her lip to keep her disappointment from escaping. His eyes glanced down again, fixed on her feet. Sofia felt a shiver run down her spine. She shifted her chair discreetly, hiding her shoes behind a corner of the tablecloth, as if hiding a secret. But it was too late. The malicious glint in his eyes betrayed that he had found the weakness he was looking for. With each laugh, Sofia felt smaller. The restaurant, once vibrant, now seemed like a stage where she was the joke. The music, the conversations from the other tables, and the sound of silverware pounded against her mind like hammer blows. She wanted to disappear, to run away, but the hope that she could still salvage this night kept her seated. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She decided to talk about something that made her happy. She mentioned her passion for books, describing how a story could transport her to other worlds. For a moment, her voice gained strength and brilliance. But he, with a dry laugh, replied, "Ah, that's just something people with nothing much to do." The fire in his eyes almost completely dimmed. At that moment, Sofia realized something was wrong, but she couldn't decide if it was with him, with her, or with the world. She didn't know yet, but that night held a silent testimony. That would change everything. The cold gaze of someone in the background observed every detail, unnoticed. Dinner passed in an uncomfortable silence. Sofia picked at her food, trying to ignore the boy's quick glances down at her. Every time he noticed her shoes, a sarcastic smile appeared on her lips. Finally, in a low voice, she murmured, "Did you really leave the house wearing those?" The tone was dismissive, but loud enough to cut like a blade. Sofia pretended not to hear, keeping her gaze fixed on her plate. Her face burned, and her heart seemed to want to escape her chest. The desire to disappear took over, but her courage still resisted. "They're just shoes," she replied in a trembling but firm voice. He laughed loudly, drawing attention from nearby tables. The laughter echoed, transforming his pain into a spectacle. A woman at another table turned her head curiously. A couple exchanged knowing glances, as if they understood the silent joke. The violins continued, but to Sofia, each note sounded like mockery. Her teary eyes began to shine in the soft candlelight. She felt like a scolded child, unprotected among strangers. He didn't stop. "Seriously, these shoes look like they've been through 3 wars, he said, laughing even louder. Some people at neighboring tables smiled discreetly, not out of amusement, but rather out of embarrassment. Sofia wanted the floor to open up. The blue dress, which had once given her hope, now seemed like a ridiculous disguise in the face of such cruelty. Her hands were shaking. He tried to hold the wine glass, but almost dropped it. The boy, noticing, shook his head as if to say, "How embarrassing." She took a deep breath, but there was no holding back the tears. One slipped timidly down her face until it disappeared at the corner of her mouth. It was a sign that her resistance was about to crumble. At the back of the room, a few heads turned to watch. Sofia noticed and shrugged, as if apologizing for existing. The shame was unbearable, and the feeling of being judged multiplied by the second. She tried to stand, but the weight of the words pinned her to the chair. He, satisfied with the scene, leaned back, crossing his arms. The waiter approached discreetly, asking if everything was okay. Sofia simply nodded, forcing a broken smile. The young man, in turn, ordered another glass of wine, as if nothing had happened. The contrast between her pain and his indifference was brutal. The candle flame flickered, as if betraying the cruelty of the scene. In the midst of it all, Sofia closed her eyes for a moment. She wanted to be home, in the silence of her room, where she could cry without witnesses. But there, exposed, there was no escape. The sounds, the looks, the muffled laughter in the background. It was all a chorus against her. She felt crushed, as if her dignity were being ripped to shreds. He, pleased with his own performance, made the final provocation. "You know what you need? A generous boss who will give you new shoes, because clearly your salary doesn't even cover that." The sentence cut like a knife, cruel and calculated. Sofia swallowed hard, tears now flowing uncontrollably. It was the final sentence of her ruined night. But what she didn't know was that every word had been overheard by someone who shouldn't have been there. A distant, cold, and attentive gaze followed every detail. The millionaire, her boss, watched the scene in silence, and something inside him began to change. Across the room, at a reserved table, the millionaire silently rested his wine glass. He was a man accustomed to ignoring the world around him, always caught up in numbers, contracts, and meetings. But that night, something made him look away from the papers on the table. A cruel laugh coming from Sofia's direction cut through the air, catching his attention like thunder in the calm. He looked up and saw her. Sofia, his devoted employee, was sitting across from a man who seemed to be enjoying herself. The contrast was painful. He knew the young woman's discipline and honesty within his home, but now he saw her cowering, humiliated in front of strangers. A strange pang tightened his chest, a sensation he hadn't remembered feeling in years. The millionaire focused on the details. He noticed her old shoes, the worn soles, her effort to hide her shame. Every detail seemed to scream a story he'd never cared to hear. While the boy laughed, he remained motionless, watching, but something inside him boiled. It was as if the indifference, carefully constructed for years, was beginning to crack. The candle on his table cast shadows across his face, revealing a look that had previously been impassive, now filled with discomfort. He felt a lump in his throat, but he couldn't explain why. Sofia, to him, had always been just the maid. And yet, there she was, bleeding inside in front of an entire room, and he couldn't look away. The waiter approached to offer another dish, but the millionaire quickly declined. He didn't want to miss a second of the scene, as if he needed it. Understand every detail. His fingers drummed on the table, betraying his unease. With each cruel word that came out of the boy's mouth, something in him broke a little more. A distant memory began to throb, a childhood in which he, too, had been ridiculed for his worn-out clothes when he still owned nothing. He swallowed hard, trying to push the past away, but the memory mingled with the image of Sofia cowering before everyone. He was no longer just seeing. He was reliving his own pain in her. For a moment, he considered standing up, intervening, but stopped himself. It wasn't his place at that moment. Pride, still present, kept him seated, but his heart was at war. The silence outside contrasted with the storm growing within him. His eyes fixed on Sofia were like a silent promise. This would not go unnoticed. The boy, unaware of the invisible audience, continued to mock. But the millionaire saw beyond the laughter. He saw a void, a desire to diminish others to feel greater. The difference between him and Sofia was glaring. Her dignity, even wounded, still shone through. The boy, on the other hand, wallowed in his own pettiness. With each passing moment, Sofia's image transformed into something deeper. She was no longer just an employee. She was a woman carrying a burden the world shouldn't impose. The millionaire felt small in the face of his own coldness. remembering how many times he'd passed her at home without even asking how she was. At that very moment, he silently decided that something had to change. He didn't yet know how or when, but he knew he couldn't forget what he'd witnessed. His eyes remained on her until the end of the night, recording every tear, every restrained gesture. And, unbeknownst to Sofia, his fate had already begun to intertwine with hers. The restaurant door closed behind her with a sharp click, as if the world were determined to mark her with a period. Sofia walked through the dark streets, trying to swallow the tears that insisted on escaping. The yellow streetlights cast long shadows, and each footstep echoed solitarily on the asphalt. Her worn shoes, which had already caused her physical discomfort, were now open wounds in her soul. She clutched her bag to her chest like a shield. She replayed each cruel word in her mind, feeling the shame multiply. War shoes, his voice echoed in her memory, cutting like a knife. Sofia shook her head, trying to banish the sound, but the more she tried to forget, the stronger it became. His laughter seemed to accompany her steps. Arriving home, she pushed open the wooden door, which creaked in protest. The room was small but cozy, with simple curtains and a worn sofa that was familiar to her tired body. Sofia flopped onto the bed without even turning on the light. The silence of the room enveloped her like a cold blanket, allowing the tears to finally flow freely. She hurriedly removed her shoes, nearly throwing them to the floor. They remained there, in the corner, like silent witnesses to the humiliation she had endured. Sofia stared at them for a moment, and the sight of the peeling leather brought an even deeper pain. It was as if those items carried the entire weight of her life, her struggle, and now her shame. If I had new shoes, maybe he would have respected me, she thought, hugging her knees and hiding her face. But soon an inner voice corrected her. It wasn't the shoes that were the problem, it was his cruelty. Still, the wound was already open. Sofia's heart was pounding heavily, as if she had lost a battle she never asked to fight. In the darkness, she tried to remember the beginning of the night, when there was still hope. The blue dress, the reflection in the mirror, the promise that it would be different. Now, everything seemed an illusion. The image of the candle flickering in the restaurant returned to her mind, only now, instead of illuminating, it seemed to dim her strength. Sofia picked up her shoes again, holding them delicately in her hands. Like a child hugging a broken toy, she held them close to her chest. Each worn seam carried memories of silent journeys, commutes to and from work, days of rain and heat. They were a part of her, but they were also the source of her greatest humiliation. Tears fell onto the aged leather, staining it anew, as if the object itself absorbed her pain. Sofia closed her eyes and, between sobs, silently prayed that no one would judge her for something so small. "I just wanted to be seen as I am," she whispered, her voice breaking. The room remained silent, but within her, the scream echoed. Deep down, a spark of resilience still burned. As painful as the night had been, Sofia knew she couldn't let that episode define her. But that spark was fragile, hidden beneath layers of shame and hurt. She needed something or someone to remind her of her true dignity. What Sofia didn't imagine was that, in a distant mansion, someone was still thinking about her. The millionaire, lying in his luxurious bed, couldn't sleep. The image of her, embraced by her own silence, haunted his mind. Her pain had penetrated the golden walls she lived in, and, without realizing it, had begun to break the icy barriers around her heart. The mansion was plunged into silence. Only the distant sound of the fountain in the garden broke the stillness of the night. The millionaire, accustomed to finding comfort in his solitude, this time felt restless. The enormous bedroom, with its expensive linens and walls covered in artwork, seemed too empty. He lay down, but couldn't sleep a wink. He turned from side to side, trying to ignore the image that kept coming back. The scene of Sofia, cowering in laughter, replayed in his mind like a cruel movie. He wondered why it affected him so much. After all, how many times had he witnessed injustice without lifting a finger? But this time was different. There was something in her expression that haunted him. She sat on the edge of the bed, resting her elbows on her knees. Memories of his own childhood came rushing back. He too had been humiliated by the old clothes he wore to school. He remembered the looks of contempt, the jokes that made him want to disappear. Perhaps that's why seeing Sofia in that situation had opened wounds he'd thought had healed. He got up and walked to the window. Outside, the garden was illuminated by small lights scattered along the stone path. Everything seemed perfect, designed to convey grandeur and power. But inside, he felt small. The wealth he had acquired could not fill the feeling of emptiness that now grew within him. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the sideboard and poured himself a glass. The golden liquid reflected the moonlight, but not even the strong taste could numb his conscience. Each sip brought back the question he didn't want to answer. Why did he care so much about Sofia? She was just a maid, someone who cleaned his rooms and served his dinners. But the truth he didn't want to admit was clear. She wasn't just anything. She'd always been. Discreet, dedicated, polite, but invisible to his eyes. Now, after that night, he could no longer ignore her. There was something in her pain. That disarmed him, as if it were a mirror showing the coldness he had cultivated for years. He set the glass aside and ran his hands over his face wearily. The question lingered. Should he simply forget? After all, it wasn't his role to solve his employees' personal problems. But his conscience wouldn't be silenced. The scene had seared itself into his mind, like an indelible mark. He remembered the moment he almost stood up to intervene, but didn't have the courage. That weight now felt like a burden. Coward, he muttered to himself, acknowledging that he could have done something and hadn't. That word hammered at his mind, eroding the pride that had always kept him distant from others. He paced the room like a caged beast. The silence of the mansion, once a symbol of peace, was now suffocating. He thought of Sofia alone, perhaps crying, perhaps blaming herself for what had happened. This image overwhelmed him, bringing a feeling he no longer remembered feeling: compassion. When he finally lay down again, he didn't close his eyes. He stared at the high ceiling, wondering how he could make amends for what he'd seen. He didn't yet know what action he'd take, but he knew something had to be done. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profits or contracts. He was thinking only of a young woman in worn-out shoes, whose dignity had been destroyed in front of everyone. The morning sun illuminated the mansion, reflecting off the enormous windows as if nothing had happened the night before. For Sofia, however, each ray felt heavy, reminding her of her recent shame. She arrived early for work, as always, trying to hide behind her impeccably pressed uniform. She walked the halls in silence, avoiding all contact. In the kitchen, she carefully arranged the dishes, as if each course were a chance to distract herself from her own pain. Her eyes were still swollen from the tears she'd shed before falling asleep. She avoided the mirror, unwilling to face the reflection of her vulnerability. Every gesture was mechanical, almost automatic, but her heart still pounded with the cruel memory. The millionaire walked slowly down the stairs. He was used to ignoring the staff who kept his house spotless, but this time his eyes were focused on just one person. Seeing her back turned, setting the table, he felt the same way, tightness in his chest from the night before. The image of Sofia, huddled in the restaurant, still burned inside him. "Good morning, Sofia," he said, breaking a silence that seemed eternal. She turned in surprise. She had never before heard her boss greet her so directly. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Good morning, sir." She immediately turned back to her work, not allowing her eyes to meet his for long. The millionaire stood still for a few seconds, watching her. He noticed the way she hid her feet under the table, as if still carrying the shame of the previous night. He wanted to say something, anything that might ease her pain, but the words stuck. Instead, he approached slowly, trying not to appear intrusive. "You look tired," he ventured, in a softer tone than usual. Sofia just smiled, not responding. It was as if an invisible wall separated her from him. The boss, accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed, felt awkward in the silence. For the first time, he wanted to be truly heard, not just respected. He then tried to change the subject. He asked how the family was, if she'd had a good night's rest. Sofia, measured, answered only what was necessary. "Everything's fine, sir." Her gaze avoided his, and each curt reply revealed not disrespect, but an effort to protect herself. It was clear. She didn't want to open the door to further pain. The millionaire realized how difficult it was to break through that wall. He felt powerless, a powerful man unable to reach an employee suffering before his eyes. Still, he didn't give up. He decided that if he couldn't reach her with words, he would find another way to show her that her pain hadn't gone unnoticed. Before leaving the kitchen, he took one last look at Sofia. She continued working diligently, but there was a quiet sadness in every movement. The millionaire took a deep breath, promising himself he would do something to change that reality. He didn't know how, but he could no longer bear the thought of remaining indifferent. Sofia, alone again, leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. She felt her heart beat faster without understanding why. That simple good morning from her boss didn't seem normal. There was something different in his tone, something that confused her and, for a moment, almost comforted her. But she quickly dismissed the thought, convinced it was just her imagination. The day wore on slowly, and Sofia immersed herself in household chores to avoid thinking about the night before. He cleaned every corner with precision, as if he could erase the marks of humiliation along with the dust. Still, the pain lingered, hidden behind a shy smile. His shoes, now stored in an old bag, weighed more than any bucket of water. The millionaire watched her from afar. He passed through the halls without saying a word, but her every gesture seemed imbued with quiet dignity. The contrast between her simplicity and the surrounding wealth stirred him. At that moment, he decided he could wait no longer. He had to do something, however small, to restore a shred of joy to her. Late in the afternoon, he discreetly asked a trusted driver to take him to the best store in town. He chose carefully, a pair of elegant shoes, made of soft leather, delicate yet sturdy. They weren't just pretty, they were a symbol of respect, of something he wanted to return to Sofia. The millionaire ran his fingers over the new material, as if testing the hope they held. When the house finally fell silent, he acted. He placed the box in front of the door to the small room that served as Sofia's resting place during breaks. The wrapping was simple but carefully done, wrapped in light paper and a discreet ribbon. There was no card, no signature, just the gift, resting like a secret waiting to be discovered. Sofia finished her chores exhausted. She was carrying a basket of clean clothes when she noticed the box in front of the door. She stopped immediately, frowning. She looked around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, lit only by the mansion's yellow lights. Her heart raced, filled with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. He knelt and touched the package carefully, as if it were something too fragile for his hands. He slowly opened the lid, and the air escaped his lungs. There they were, new, impeccable shoes, so perfect they shone even in the dim light. Sofia clapped her hand over her mouth, her eyes filling with tears she couldn't hold back. For a few seconds she stood still, unsure of what to feel. Gratitude? Fear? Shame? The gift was beautiful, but it also raised questions. Who had left it? Why? Sofia closed the box quickly, as if afraid of being caught admiring something that didn't belong to her. She tucked it under her bed, hidden like a forbidden treasure. Lying in bed later, she couldn't sleep. The image of the shoes kept coming back, mingling with the echo of the cruel words she'd heard the night before. It was as if the universe had simultaneously shown her human cruelty and kindness. But uncertainty weighed heavily on her. Wouldn't accepting that gift mean betraying herself? Sofia spent hours reflecting, her hands clutching the bundle hidden under the mattress. She wanted to put them on, feel different, maybe even be reborn. But something inside her told her she couldn't accept charity. Her wounded pride was still her only armor. So she closed her eyes and decided that, at least for now, they would remain untouched. On the other side of the mansion, the millionaire waited in silence. He didn't ask questions, didn't comment, just watched from afar. Deep down, he knew the gift might not be accepted immediately. But he also knew he had taken the first step toward breaking down the wall between them, and that, in itself, was already beginning to change everything. The next morning, Sofia woke earlier than usual. The room was still in darkness, but her eyes immediately fixed on the bundle hidden under the bed. The memory of the previous night returned like a lit flame. The moment she found the shoes, the new glow in her worn-out life. It was as if a voice was calling her to put them on. She gently pulled the box open and slowly opened the lid, as if desecrating a secret. The shoes were there, perfect, untouched, so different from anything he'd ever owned. She ran, her hand over the soft leather, and for a moment imagined herself walking into a dining room with her head held high, unafraid of stairs. Her heart beat faster, but then she remembered the cruel laughter in the restaurant. "No, I can't," she murmured to herself, closing the box firmly. Her wounded pride throbbed louder than her desire. For Sofia, accepting that gift was like admitting she couldn't achieve anything on her own. It was like confirming that the young man at the restaurant was right, that she was small, dependent, incapable, and she couldn't bear that. As she tidied the kitchen later, her mind was elsewhere. She thought about the hidden shoes, as if they were a forbidden temptation. Every time she passed the reflection in a mirror or shiny surface, she imagined how would stand on his feet. But then he would immediately punish himself for it, remembering that he did not want to live off the generosity of others. At lunchtime, a teammate commented on her unusual smile that morning. Sofia tried to hide it, denying it, but deep down, she knew it was impossible not to be touched by that mysterious gift. The mere fact that someone had thought of her made her tremble. But once again, the question arose: who had done this? And why? In the privacy of her room, she opened the box once more. This time, she couldn't resist. She removed the shoes from the wrapping and placed them on her feet. Her heart raced as if committing a sin. She put them on slowly, feeling the perfect fit, the lightness of the new material. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall, and for a moment she barely recognized herself. Sofia spun around, took a few steps, and the feeling was indescribable. It was like walking on clouds, like carrying a piece of dignity she had lost. She smiled shyly, but it quickly faded. She tore off her shoes and put them back. "They're not mine," she repeated softly, almost like a mantra. The struggle inside her was fierce. That night, lying in bed, she considered returning the gift. She imagined knocking on doors, asking who had left it. But she soon realized she couldn't. There were no clues, nor was she brave enough to admit she'd tampered with the box. The mystery gnawed at her, but at the same time, it kept alive a spark of hope she didn't want to admit. From across the mansion, the millionaire watched discreetly. He'd noticed the slight glint in her eyes, the change in her step, even when she tried to hide it. He could tell she'd touched his shoes, even though she wasn't wearing them. A small relief welled up in his chest. He hadn't been rejected completely. There was still a chance. Sofia, however, fell asleep with a divided heart. Torn between pride and need, between pain and hope, she knew those shoes weren't just footwear. They were a symbol, a silent invitation to believe she still deserved respect and beauty. But accepting that invitation meant giving up the last shield that still protected her, her pride. Dinner at the mansion was ready, as it was every night. The table was set with glasses lined up, steaming dishes, and the subtle glow of the chandeliers reflected on the silverware. Sofia moved around the room with light steps, trying to maintain her routine. But the millionaire, sitting at the head of the table, observed her every detail with unusual attention. His eyes instinctively dropped to her feet, and there they were, the same old shoes, worn, almost peeling at the edges. His heart sank. He expected to see her wearing the gift, walking with renewed confidence. But the silence of those ancient shoes was a painful answer. She had chosen not to accept him. Sofia felt the weight of his gaze and hesitated for a moment. Her face remained serene, but her heart raced. She knew he had noticed, knew that absence spoke louder than any words. Still, he lifted the tray and continued serving as if nothing had happened. It was his way of protecting himself. The millionaire took a deep breath, trying to contain his frustration. In his mind, he imagined 1,000 reasons for the refusal. Perhaps pride, perhaps distrust, perhaps fear. He didn't dare ask. But the image of those old shoes became a glaring symbol of something greater. The invisible barrier that still existed between them. Silence hung heavy over the table. Other employees milled about, but none noticed the subtle tension between boss and maid. He absently stirred his glass, his eyes occasionally returning to Sofia's feet. It was a duel of unspoken glances, a conversation held only by the absence of the gesture he expected. Sofia, for her part, felt exposed. With each step, her shoes seemed heavier, as if the worn leather shouted to the world her poverty. She secretly longed to wear the new pair, to feel different, but pride still prevailed. She didn't want to appear dependent, much less an object of pity. This dilemma consumed her. As she cleared the plates, Sofia finally looked up and met his eyes for a moment. There were no words, just a brief meeting of worlds. His gaze was steady, but not judgmental. It was a mixture of sadness and anticipation. Hers, on the other hand, held fear, resistance, and a hint of shame. The millionaire looked away, clutching his glass tightly. Never before had he cared so much about something as simple as a pair of shoes. And yet, it seemed as if all her dignity was concentrated there. Frustration wasn't with Sofia, but with himself, for not being able to break down the wall she had built between them. When the table was cleared and the room fell silent, Sofia picked up her tray and hurried out. As she walked through the door, she sighed deeply, as if carrying an invisible weight. She knew she had disappointed someone that night, but she couldn't help it. Pride was her last defense. In the empty room, the millionaire remained alone, staring into the void before him. He realized that offering gifts wasn't enough. He needed to offer something greater, something real. He silently resolved that he would soon find a way to reveal to her that he had been by her side that night, and that he had heard every cruel word. The morning was quiet in the mansion, but Sofia carried an invisible weight. With every step through the hallways, she remembered the night before, her boss's intense gaze and the awkward silence between them. She tried to push these thoughts away by immersing herself in her tasks, but her mind kept returning to the same point. Her shoes hidden under the bed, untouched. The millionaire went down to breakfast, but he wasn't interested in the meal. His eyes immediately sought Sofia, finding her as she set the table. The air seemed thicker when she was near. He knew he couldn't delay any longer. Something inside him urged him to reveal the truth, to end the mystery and bridge the distance that still separated them. "Sofia," he called in a calm but firm voice. She looked up in surprise, still holding the juice jug. "Yesterday, I noticed you're still wearing those shoes." The sentence hung heavy in the air, and her heart raced. She gripped the jug tightly, afraid her trembling hands would betray her. "They're comfortable, sir," he replied simply, trying to disguise the truth. But he didn't look away. For a moment the silence was crueler than any words. Then, almost without realizing it, the millionaire blurted out, "I saw them, that night, at the restaurant." The jar slipped slightly from her hands, almost falling. Sofia's eyes widened, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "You were there?" Her voice was a whisper, thick with shock and shame. Her heart pounded, remembering every detail of the humiliation. Now she realized she hadn't been as alone as she'd imagined. He took a deep breath, his throat drying up. There was no turning back. "Yes, Sofia, I was there, and I heard everything." The words fell between them like stones thrown into a pond, creating ripples that spread to the very core of her being. Sofia felt her face burn, tears threatening to spill over. "So, you saw?" he asked, his voice breaking. Her gaze was a mixture of shame and pain, as if the simple confirmation was unbearable. The millionaire nodded silently, unable to say anything more. The confession had already changed everything. Sofia leaned against the table, trying to contain the trembling in her hands. It was as if all the Shame of that night had returned in two. It wasn't enough to have been humiliated by a stranger. Now she knew that her boss, a distant and powerful man, had witnessed her fragility. She felt completely exposed. The millionaire, however, didn't look away. In her eyes he saw not only pain, but also a strength she herself might not have recognized. "I shouldn't have remained silent," he said quietly. "I should have done something." This admission, coming from him, who had always carried the image of coldness, broke down part of the wall that separated them. Sofia didn't answer. She just took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. The truth had been told, and there was no turning back. Between them now lay a new reality. He was no longer just the distant boss, and she was no longer just the invisible employee. There was a shared secret, a bond forged in pain. The silence after the revelation seemed endless. Sofia kept her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, avoiding her boss's gaze. Her breathing was rapid, and her hands trembled slightly. Inside, she was fighting a battle, whether to hide behind silence or allow her pain to finally be heard. The millionaire waited, respecting her time. He wasn't used to waiting for answers from anyone. He'd always been a man of orders, not of listening. But in front of Sofia, he realized that any hasty word could raise even higher walls. So he remained quiet, offering only his presence. "It was horrible," she began, almost in a whisper. Her choked voice sounded like a forced confession. I've never felt so small in my life." He laughed at me, at my shoes, as if I were nothing. And everyone stared, laughed, too. The tears finally escaped, sliding silently down her cheeks. She looked up for a moment, staring at him. "I wanted to disappear, sir. I wanted to shrink into nothingness. But I couldn't. I had to stand there, listening, like a walking joke. The pain." In her voice was raw, almost palpable. The millionaire felt his stomach churn, as if every word were an accusation against him too. "And the worst thing," he continued, "is that these shoes aren't just shoes. They're part of my life. I bought them when I got my first steady job. I walked miles in them, braved the rain, the cold. They accompanied me through every achievement, no matter how small. And suddenly, they became a source of shame." The millionaire took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the revelation. He realized that the gift he had given her was not just a simple gesture. It was a shock to her very identity. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't know they meant so much." For the first time, his usual coldness seemed broken, revealing a human, imperfect man. Sofia wiped her tears with her hands, but she couldn't contain her pain. "It's not just about the shoes," he confessed. "It's about how the world sees us. About how being poor means, for many, being invisible until it becomes a joke. I try hard, I work hard, but it never seems to be enough. There's always something missing. There's always shame." He listened to her as if each word were a revelation of the world he had chosen to ignore for years. His heart, accustomed to the weight of business, now tightened with something deeper: guilt. He realized that Sofia was speaking not just of one night, but of a lifetime of silent humiliation. "I wanted to defend you," he said quietly, almost like a confession. "But I kept quiet. Coward." Sofia looked at him, surprised to hear that term coming from such a powerful man. For the first time, she saw in him not just her boss, but someone who also bore his own wounds. Sofia's tears slowly subsided. The pain was still there, but there was a relief in being able to share it. For the first time, she felt someone truly listen to her, without judgment, without rushing. Between them, a fragile bond was formed, born of pain, but capable of transforming everything. The silence after Sofia's outburst seemed too heavy to break. The millionaire remained motionless, but his eyes held a whirlwind of memories he tried to keep buried. Finally, he took a deep breath and spoke in a low, almost confessional tone. "You're not the only one who's been humiliated by the shoes they wore." Sofia looked up in surprise. "The boss rarely spoke about you, much less in the first person." He rested his elbows on the table and continued. "I grew up with nothing. My mother sewed used clothes so I had something to wear. My shoes were always someone else's leftovers, and every time I walked to school, I felt the eyes burning me. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the past were a physical weight on his shoulders. I'll never forget the time they made fun of me because the sole of my shoe split in the middle of class. The laughter still echoes in my mind. I swore that day that I would never be laughed at again, that I would have everything, that no one would dare to belittle me again. Sofia watched him silently, absorbing every word. For the first time, she saw through the cold armor he'd always worn. He wasn't just a wealthy and distant man. He was someone who had also learned to survive the invisible wounds of shame. Her heart, previously closed, began to soften at this revelation. He continued, his voice firm but filled with pain. I gained wealth, status, respect. But to do so, I had to harden. I stopped feeling, stopped caring. It was easier to ignore others than to relive the pain I carried. Until I saw you that night. His gaze fixed on Sofia, and the sincerity was impossible to deny. Her tears welled up again, but now they weren't just tears of pain, they were also tears of empathy. You know what it's like, too, she murmured. He nodded, his smile sad. I know, and that's what broke me inside. Because while you were humiliated, I relived my own past, but I didn't have the courage to stand up. Sofia lowered her eyes, taking a deep breath. Maybe you didn't get up that night, but you're getting up now. The words came naturally, filled with a tenderness she hadn't expected to feel. The millionaire looked at her, touched, and realized that this employee, so invisible to him for years, was now the only one capable of seeing the truth. He reached out his hand across the table, hesitant, as if offering not only comfort but also a silent pact. Sofia hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand over his. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. Two stories marked by pain meeting at a common point of humanity. For a few seconds, the world seemed to stand still. There was no mansion, no boss, no maid, no social differences. Just two wounded souls who recognized themselves in each other. The weight of shame began to give way to something new, understanding, and deep down, a spark of hope. The millionaire smiled, genuinely for the first time. Maybe those old shoes aren't a symbol of shame, Sofia. Maybe they're a trophy. Proof of everything you've faced and overcome. She took a deep breath, absorbing his words like someone receiving a balm. For the first time in days, she managed to smile back. It was a typical late afternoon, and Sofia had gone out to buy some groceries. She carried a simple bag, walking through the busy city streets. She was tired, but there was something different about her posture. Since her conversation with her boss, she felt lighter, as if some of the weight she'd been carrying had been lifted. Suddenly, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Sofia? She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, her heart racing. She turned slowly and, to her surprise, saw the young man from the restaurant. The same arrogant smile was plastered on his face as if nothing had happened. It was like a ghost returning to test her strength. He approached, hands in his pockets, trying to appear casual. Look, I thought I'd never see you again, about that night. Maybe I exaggerated. But you know, I was just joking. The false lightness in his voice was even crueler. Sofia felt a chill, but didn't look away. Joking, she repeated firmly, looking him straight in the eye. For once, there was no tremor in her voice. You humiliated me in front of everyone. You made fun of what I carry as part of my life. That's not a joke. That's cruel. His smile faltered for a moment, surprised by the firmness he hadn't expected to find. Trying to regain control, he laughed, shaking his head. Oh, don't take it so seriously. You looked pretty that night, you just needed better shoes. But, as she said this, she realized her mistake. Sofia lifted her chin, determined, and her presence seemed much greater than it had that night at the restaurant. It's not my shoes that define me, he said firmly. They tell my story, every struggle, every achievement, and unlike you, I don't need to put anyone down to feel great. People on the sidewalk began to pay attention, some stopping to listen. The young man began to feel exposed. He tried to change the subject, but the words came out jumbled. Sofia, however, didn't back down. That night, you made me feel ashamed of my existence. Today, I don't feel that anymore. Because I've learned that my worth doesn't depend on the laughter of people like you. There was power in every syllable, and even the wind seemed to quiet down to listen. For a moment the boy was speechless. His gaze shifted from hers, and his once confident face now betrayed discomfort. Finally he murmured something like an apology, but as empty as his arrogance. Sofia simply took a deep breath and replied, "I don't need your apology. I just need you to never do to anyone else what you did to me." With that, she turned and continued on her way, her bag firmly in her hands and her steps sure on the ground. Her heart was pounding, but not with fear, with victory. For the first time since that night, she felt truly free. No longer a victim of humiliation, but someone who had found her voice. From afar, a figure watched discreetly, the millionaire, who had watched the scene from inside a parked car. His eyes shone with pride. Sofia needed no defense. She had defended herself. And in that moment, he realized, her true wealth had always been in the dignity she never lost. The next morning, Sofia woke up different. The simple room looked the same, but the air carried a new lightness. She sat up in bed, pulled out the box hidden under the mattress, and slowly opened it. The new shoes were still there, untouched, waiting for her. This time, there was no hesitation. They weren't a pity gift. They were a choice she finally accepted. She put them on slowly, feeling for the perfect fit. She looked at herself in the small mirror leaning against the wall and smiled. It wasn't just the beauty of the shoes that transformed her, but the knowledge that she now walked with her head held high. Reflection showed not just a maid, but a woman who had come through pain and found strength within herself. As she left for work, her footsteps sounded different in the mansion's hallway. They were no longer the heavy echo of someone trying to hide, but the steady thump of someone who knew who she was. The other employees noticed the gleam in her eyes but didn't ask questions. It was as if they all sensed something inside her had changed. The millionaire saw her enter the dining room and, for a moment, lost his breath. There stood Sofia, wearing the shoes she had finally chosen to accept. The discreet smile she gave him was enough to light up the entire room. He didn't need words. He understood that that gesture was more powerful than any conversation. During coffee, the atmosphere seemed different. Sofia served as always, but there was dignity in every movement. He, watching in silence, felt he was before someone greater than any wealth could buy. It was as if he had learned a lesson no amount of money could teach. Later, leaving the mansion, Sofia walked through the busy streets. She felt the stares, but this time not as wounds, but as recognition. It didn't matter whether people noticed her shoes or not. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. She carried with her something more valuable, the certainty that her dignity was untouchable. On the way, she passed a shop window and paused for a moment. The reflection showed a confident, self-assured woman, ready to face the world. She remembered the night at the restaurant, the laughter, the embarrassment, but instead of pain, she felt only gratitude. That humiliation had been the trigger for her to discover her own strength. Back at the mansion, the millionaire found her in the garden. He approached with firm steps and simply said, "I'm glad you chose to wear them." Sofia smiled without lowering her eyes, and replied, "I didn't need them to be who I am, but I needed to remember who I was." He nodded respectfully. The silence that followed wasn't one of distance, but of complicity. For the first time, there was no longer a master and a maid, but two people who had been transformed through pain and courage. The sun illuminated the garden, and the gentle wind seemed to carry the promise of a new beginning. As she walked confidently, Sofia knew that life would still bring challenges, but now each step would be taken with determination. The shoes were not just a gift, they were a symbol that dignity cannot be taken away, only forgotten, and she had resolved never to forget it again. If this story touched your heart, leave your comment below. Have you ever judged or been judged by appearances? I'd love to hear about your experience. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any of the next exciting stories. Every detail can change a life, and maybe yours is about to change too.